The morning sun was already fierce when Grace Edwards knelt beside the creek, threading a rusted needle through the same worn calico fabric she had mended a dozen times before, her fingers raw and red from the effort of trying to make something whole that was beyond saving. She sat on a flat rock near the water's edge, her bare feet dangling just above the surface as she worked the needle through the thin material of her only dress. The fabric had once been a cheerful yellow with tiny white flowers, but years of washing in harsh lye soap and the relentless California sun had faded it to a pale ghost of its former self. The hem was frayed beyond repair, and now a long tear ran up the side seam from where it had caught on a nail in the boarding house wall. Grace bit her lower lip in concentration, trying to make her stitches small and even, though she knew it hardly mattered. The dress was falling apart, and no amount of careful mending would change that fact. It was 1882, and Calico, California, was a silver mining town that had exploded almost overnight, from nothing into a bustling community of miners, merchants, and dreamers. Grace had arrived 6 months earlier with her father, who had been convinced that his luck would change in the silver mines. Instead, he had died 3 weeks after their arrival when a mine shaft collapsed. Grace had been 19 years old, alone, and nearly penniless. She had taken work at the boarding house, cleaning rooms and washing linens for 50 cents a day, in a small room under the eaves. It was honest work, but it barely kept her fed, and there was nothing left over for luxuries like new clothing. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up. A rider was approaching along the creek path, and Grace instinctively pulled her torn dress closer around her legs, though she was still decent enough. The horse was a fine bay gelding, and the man riding it sat tall in the saddle with the easy confidence of someone who had spent most of his life on horseback. As he drew closer, Grace recognized him as one of the cowboys who worked at the sprawling ranch outside town. She had seen him a few times in Calico, always polite and quiet, never causing the kind of trouble that some of the miners did when they came to town, with silver in their pockets and liquor on their breath. He slowed his horse as he approached, touching the brim of his hat in a respectful gesture. Grace quickly tucked the needle into the fabric and stood, acutely aware of how she must look, with her faded, torn dress and her dark hair coming loose from its braid. "Morning, miss," the cowboy said. His voice was deep and pleasant, with a slight drawl that spoke of somewhere farther south. "Sorry to disturb you, just watering my horse." "Of course," Grace said, stepping back from the creek's edge. "I was just leaving." But she did not leave. Instead, she stood there awkwardly, holding the wadded fabric of her dress in her hands, watching as he dismounted with a fluid grace and led his horse to the water. He was tall, probably in his mid-20s, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his worn cotton shirt. His face was tanned from long days in the sun, and his eyes were a striking gray-green color that reminded Grace of the sage that grew in the hills around Calico. The horse drank deeply, and the cowboy stood quietly, holding the reins loosely in one hand. After a moment, he glanced at Grace, then at the fabric in her hands, and she saw something flicker across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. His eyes took in her worn dress, her too thin frame, and then returned to her face with a gentleness that made her throat tighten. "That is a lot of mending," he said quietly. Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. "It is my only dress," she said, and immediately regretted the words. She sounded pitiful, and she had sworn to herself after her father died that she would never be pitiful. She would work hard, keep her dignity, and make her own way in the world, no matter how difficult it might be. The cowboy's expression did not change, but something in his eyes softened. "I am sorry," he said simply. "That must be difficult." Grace lifted her chin. "I manage well enough." He nodded slowly, as if considering her words. "I am sure you do. My name is Graham Edwards, by the way. I work at the Triple Bar Ranch." "Grace Bennett," she said automatically, then realized with a start that they shared the same last name. "No relation, I suppose?" A slight smile touched his lips. "No relation," he agreed, "though it is a good name." They stood in silence for a moment, and Grace found herself studying him more closely. There was something solid and dependable about him, something that made her think of oak trees and stone foundations. He wore his gun belt low on his hips, but the holster looked well used and practical rather than showy. His clothes were clean but worn, the kind of working clothes that saw hard use every day. He was not a wealthy man, that was clear, but there was a quiet competence about him that spoke of someone who knew his work and did it well. "I should let you get back to your mending," Graham said, gathering his reins. "I did not mean to interrupt." "You did not interrupt anything important," Grace said, and then added impulsively, "There is not much point in mending something that is falling apart anyway." Graham swung back into his saddle with easy grace, but he paused before turning his horse. "Sometimes the things that seem most broken are the ones most worth saving," he said. Then he touched his hat brim again and rode away, leaving Grace standing by the creek with her torn dress in her hands and a strange warmth spreading through her chest. She watched him until he disappeared around the bend in the path, then slowly sank back down onto her rock and resumed her mending. But her hands were shaking slightly, and she had to start the seam twice before she could get the stitches right. That evening, Grace worked late at the boarding house, scrubbing floors until her back ached and her knees were sore. Mrs. Chen, who ran the establishment, was a practical woman who believed in hard work and fair treatment. She paid Grace on time and never asked questions about her circumstances, for which Grace was grateful, but she also expected a full day's work for a day's pay, and Grace was determined to prove herself worthy of the position. When she finally climbed the narrow stairs to her tiny room under the eaves, she was exhausted. She hung her dress carefully on the single nail that served as her closet and washed herself with cold water from the basin. She had one other garment, a thin cotton nightgown that had belonged to her mother, and she pulled it on gratefully before collapsing onto her narrow bed. But sleep would not come. She kept thinking about the cowboy by the creek, about the way he had looked at her with such understanding in his eyes. She was not used to kindness from strangers. Most men in Calico either ignored her entirely or looked at her with a different kind of interest, the kind that made her walk faster and keep her eyes down. But Graham Edwards had looked at her as if she were a person, not just a poor girl in a worn-out dress. She rolled over and stared at the sloped ceiling above her bed. It was foolish to think about him. He was just a cowboy, and she was just a boarding house worker. Their paths had crossed for a few minutes by the creek, and that was all. By tomorrow, he would have forgotten the encounter entirely, but Grace found that she could not forget it. As she finally drifted off to sleep, she found herself remembering the color of his eyes and the gentle tone of his voice. The next morning dawned hot and clear, the way most mornings did in Calico. Grace rose early as always and dressed in her mended dress. The seam she had sewn the day before was already pulling loose in one spot, but she had no time to fix it. There were breakfast dishes to wash and beds to make and chamber pots to empty. The work was endless and unglamorous, but it was work, and Grace was grateful for it. She was in the kitchen, elbow deep in dishwater, when Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway with an odd expression on her face. "Grace, there is someone here to see you," she said. Grace looked up in surprise, wiping her wet hands on her apron. "To see me? Who?" "A cowboy. He is waiting in the front parlor." Mrs. Chen's expression was inscrutable, but there was a hint of curiosity in her dark eyes. "He says he has something for you." Grace's heart began to beat faster. She untied her apron with trembling fingers and followed Mrs. Chen through the narrow hallway to the front of the boarding house. The parlor was a small, neat room where Mrs. Chen sometimes entertained the more respectable lodgers. Graham Edwards stood by the window, his hat in his hands, looking slightly out of place among the fussy curtains and china figurines. When he saw Grace, he turned, and that same gentle expression crossed his face. "Miss Bennet," he said, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Grace said, though her mind was racing. Why had he come? What could he possibly want with her? Graham cleared his throat. "I have been thinking about what you said yesterday, about your dress being your only one, and I thought—" He broke off, then started again. "There is a dry goods store in town, and the proprietor is a friend of mine. I spoke with him this morning, and he has agreed to extend you credit for some fabric and notions. Or ready-made dresses if you prefer, whatever you need." Grace stared at him, not understanding. "Credit? But I cannot afford—" "It is already paid for," Graham said quickly. "I mean, I have arranged it. You just need to go to the store and select what you want." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. She looked at him, at his earnest face and his kind eyes, and felt something crack open inside her chest. "You paid for me to buy dresses?" "Yes," Graham said simply. "I hope that is all right. I did not mean to presume, but it seemed like, well, everyone needs more than one dress." Grace's eyes filled with tears, and she turned away quickly, pressing her hand to her mouth. She had not cried when her father died, or when she had to sell their few possessions to pay for his burial, or during any of the long, lonely months that followed. But this simple act of kindness from a stranger undid her completely. "I am sorry," Graham said, sounding alarmed. "I did not mean to upset you. If I have offended—" "No," Grace managed to say, though her voice was thick with tears. "No, you have not offended me. I do not know what to say." "You do not have to say anything," Graham said gently. "Just go to the store and pick out some dresses. 3, Mr. Henderson said, would be reasonable, or the fabric to make them, if you prefer." Grace turned back to face him, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Why would you do this? You do not even know me." Graham was quiet for a long moment, turning his hat in his hands. "My mother died when I was 12, he said finally. "She had one dress, and she mended it until there was more mending than original fabric. My father could have afforded to buy her new dresses, but he was a hard man, and he did not see the point in what he called frivolous spending. She never complained, but I remember thinking even then that it was not right, that she deserved better." He looked up at Grace, and his eyes were full of old pain and new determination. "I could not help my mother, but I can help you, if you will let me." Grace felt fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I do not know how to thank you." "You do not need to thank me," Graham said. "Just go get your dresses." The dry goods store was on the main street of Calico, sandwiched between a saloon and a lawyer's office. Grace had walked past it 100 times, but had never gone inside, knowing that everything within was far beyond her means. Now, with Graham's words still ringing in her ears, she pushed open the door and stepped into a world of color and possibility. The store smelled of new fabric and leather and the faint sweetness of peppermint sticks. Bolts of cloth lined the walls in every color imaginable, and ready-made dresses hung from hooks near the back. There were buttons and ribbons and laces, sewing needles in neat packages, and spools of thread in a rainbow of shades. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, was a round man with spectacles and a friendly smile. "You must be Miss Bennett," he said. "Mr. Edwards told me to expect you. Now, let me see. He said 3 dresses or the equivalent in fabric and notions. What strikes your fancy?" Grace moved through the store in a daze, her fingers trailing over the fabrics. There was a practical brown wool that would be warm in winter, a sturdy blue cotton that would wear well, and a soft green calico that reminded her of the dress her mother had worn on Sundays. But her eyes kept returning to a ready-made dress on the back wall. It was a deep burgundy color, with a modest neckline and long sleeves, and tiny pearl buttons down the front. It was the most beautiful thing Grace had ever seen. "That one would suit you," Mr. Henderson said, following her gaze. "Good quality, too. It will last for years." "How much does it cost?" Grace asked hesitantly. Mr. Henderson waved his hand. "Mr. Edwards has already taken care of everything. You just choose what you want, up to 3 dresses." In the end, Grace selected the burgundy dress, along with a practical gray cotton work dress and a simple blue dress that would be suitable for everyday wear. Mr. Henderson wrapped them carefully in brown paper and tied the bundle with string, and Grace walked out of the store feeling as if she were floating. She went straight back to the boarding house, took the stairs 2 at a time to her little room, and unwrapped the dresses with trembling hands. The burgundy one fit her perfectly, skimming her slim figure and bringing out the warm tones in her dark hair. When she looked at herself in the small, cracked mirror on her wall, she hardly recognized the young woman looking back at her. She wore the burgundy dress down to dinner that evening, and Mrs. Chen raised her eyebrows but said nothing. The other boarders, mostly miners and a traveling salesman, barely noticed. But Grace felt different. She felt like a person who mattered, like someone worthy of kindness and consideration. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought about Graham Edwards. She thought about the pain in his eyes when he spoke of his mother, and the quiet determination in his voice when he said he wanted to help. She thought about the way he had looked at her, not with pity, but with genuine compassion and respect, and she realized, with a start that made her sit up in bed, that she wanted to see him again. The next few weeks passed in a strange kind of suspended animation. Grace went about her work at the boarding house with renewed energy, wearing her new dresses and feeling almost like a different person. She kept expecting Graham to come back, to check on her, or see how the dresses had worked out. But he did not appear. She looked for him every time she walked through town, scanning the faces of the cowboys who rode past or tied their horses outside the saloon. But she never saw him. She began to think that perhaps the encounter had meant nothing to him, that it had been simply an act of charity that he had already forgotten. The thought made her chest ache in a way she did not quite understand. Then, nearly 3 weeks after he had bought her the dresses, she saw him again. She was at the general store, buying a few necessities with the small wages Mrs. Chen had paid her, when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Miss Bennet." She turned, and there he was, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands and that same gentle expression in his eyes. He looked tired, with dust on his clothes and a shadow of stubble on his jaw, as if he had been working long days without much rest. "Mr. Edwards," Grace said, and was surprised by how breathless her voice sounded. "I have been hoping to see you." Something flickered in his eyes. "You have?" "Yes," Grace said. "I wanted to thank you again. For the dresses. I cannot tell you what they have meant to me." Graham's expression softened. "You are wearing one of them now. It looks very nice." Grace glanced down at the blue everyday dress she had chosen that morning. "It is the most beautiful thing I have ever owned," she said honestly. "All 3 of them are." They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, and Grace felt something shift in the air between them. It was as if a door had opened, revealing possibilities she had not dared to imagine. "I have been away," Graham said. "We were moving cattle to the high pastures. That is why I have not been in town." "Oh," Grace said, and felt a little thrill at the realization that he was explaining his absence as if it mattered, as if he thought she might have been wondering. "That sounds like hard work." "It is," Graham agreed. "But it is good work, honest work." He hesitated, then added, "I was wondering if you might like to take a walk sometime. If you have time, I mean. I know you work long hours." Grace's heart began to beat very fast. "I would like that," she said. "I have Sunday afternoons off." "This Sunday?" Graham asked. "Yes," Grace said. "This Sunday would be perfect." Sunday dawned bright and clear, and Grace woke with a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. She dressed carefully in the burgundy dress, brushing her dark hair until it shone and pinning it up in a simple style. She had no jewelry or fancy accessories, but the dress itself was beautiful enough that she did not think she needed them. Graham arrived at the boarding house precisely at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, freshly shaved and wearing clean clothes. He offered Grace his arm, and they set out walking through the dusty streets of Calico. The town was quieter on Sundays, with most of the mines closed and the saloons less crowded. Graham led Grace away from the main street, following a narrow path that wound up into the hills behind the town. As they walked, they talked, and Grace found herself telling him things she had not spoken of in months. She told him about her father, about how he had been a dreamer who always believed the next opportunity would be the one that changed everything. She told him about coming to Calico and losing him so suddenly, about the terror and loneliness of being left alone in a strange town. Graham listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful and compassionate. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he began to talk about his own life. He had grown up on a small ranch in Texas, the only son of a harsh, unforgiving father. His mother had been gentle and kind, the buffer between Graham and his father's temper. When she died, Graham had stayed for 2 more years, trying to keep the ranch running, but his father's drinking had gotten worse, and eventually Graham had left. He had been 17, with nothing but his horse and his saddle, and a fierce determination never to be dependent on anyone else. He had worked on ranches across Texas and New Mexico, before ending up in California. The Triple Bar Ranch was a good place, he said, with fair owners and decent pay. He had been there for 3 years now, and he was starting to save a little money. Not much, but enough to make him think about the future. "What kind of future?" Grace asked as they paused at the top of a hill, looking out over the sprawling desert landscape. Graham was quiet for a long moment. "A small ranch of my own, maybe," he said finally. "Nothing fancy, just enough land to run a few head of cattle, a house with a good roof, and a garden for vegetables." He glanced at her, and there was something vulnerable in his expression. "A family someday." Grace felt her cheeks grow warm. "That sounds like a good future." "What about you?" Graham asked. "What do you want for your future?" Grace had never really thought about it before. Since her father's death, she had been focused entirely on survival, on getting through each day. But now, standing on this hill with Graham beside her, she found herself imagining possibilities. I want to feel safe, she said slowly. And I want to have a home, a real home, not just a room in a boarding house. I want to wake up in the morning and not be afraid of what the day might bring. Graham reached out and took her hand, and Grace felt a warm shock run through her at the contact. You deserve all of that, he said quietly. You deserve to feel safe and to have a home and to be happy. They stood there on the hilltop, hands clasped, looking out over the vast California desert, and Grace felt something settle inside her, something that felt like hope. Over the following months, Graham and Grace fell into a pattern. He would come to town every Sunday, and they would walk together, exploring the hills around Calico, or simply strolling through the streets, talking about everything and nothing. Graham was not a man of many words, but when he spoke, it was always thoughtful and genuine. He told Grace about the cattle drives he had been on, about the wild beauty of the open range, about the satisfaction of a hard day's work well done. Grace, in turn, found herself opening up in ways she never had before. She told Graham about her mother, who had died when Grace was 15, about the books she loved to read when she could get her hands on them, about her secret dream of learning to paint someday. "Why do you not start now?" Graham asked one Sunday as they sat by the creek where they had first met. "I have no supplies," Grace said. "Paint and brushes and canvas cost money." "Then we will get you some," Graham said simply. "No," Grace said firmly. "You have already done so much for me. Too much. I cannot accept anything more." Graham looked at her seriously. "Grace, when I give you something, it is not charity. It is because I care about you, and I want to see you happy. There is a difference." Grace felt her eyes prick with tears. "Why do you care about me? You barely know me." "That is not true," Graham said. "I know you better than I have known most people in my life. I know you are strong and brave and kind. I know you work harder than anyone I have ever met. I know you have been through things that would have broken most people, but you are still standing." He reached out and took her hand. "And I know that when I am with you, I feel more like myself than I ever have before." Grace looked into his eyes and saw the truth there, plain and simple. He cared for her, really, truly cared for her. And she realized, with a rush of emotion that left her breathless, that she cared for him too. More than cared, she was falling in love with him. "Graham," she whispered, and then she could not find any more words. He understood anyway. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and then his lips touched hers in a kiss that was gentle and sweet and full of promise. Grace's eyes fluttered closed, and she kissed him back, pouring all of her feelings into that one perfect moment. When they finally pulled apart, they were both smiling. "I have been wanting to do that for weeks," Graham admitted. "So have I," Grace said, and laughed at the surprise on his face. They sat by the creek for a long time after that, talking and occasionally stealing more kisses. The sun moved across the sky, casting long shadows, and still they sat, reluctant to let the day end. Finally, as evening approached, Graham walked Grace back to the boarding house. At the door, he took both of her hands in his. "Grace, I want to court you properly," he said. "I want everyone to know that you are important to me. Would that be all right?" "More than all right," Grace said, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Word spread quickly in a town as small as Calico. Within a week, everyone knew that Graham Edwards was courting Grace Bennett, and opinions were divided. Some people, like Mrs. Chen, seemed pleased and offered their approval with knowing smiles and nods. Others, particularly some of the miners who had harbored their own hopeless attractions to Grace, grumbled about cowboys thinking they were better than working men. But Grace did not care about the opinions of others. She only cared that Graham came to see her every Sunday, and sometimes during the week as well, when his work allowed. He brought her small gifts, thoughtful things that showed he had been paying attention to her words. A book of poetry she had mentioned wanting to read, a small set of watercolor paints and paper, a jar of honey from the ranch, because she had once said she loved the taste of honey in her tea. In return, Grace began baking for him, using the boarding house kitchen on her rare, free evenings to make simple cakes and cookies. She was not much of a cook, having had little opportunity to learn, but Graham ate everything she made with apparent enjoyment and always asked for the recipes as if they were treasures. One evening in early autumn, when the brutal heat of summer had finally begun to ease, Graham arrived at the boarding house with a serious expression on his face. "Can we talk?" he asked, and Grace felt a flutter of nervousness. They walked to their usual spot by the creek, and Graham helped Grace settle on the flat rock where she had been mending her dress all those months ago. He paced back and forth for a moment, his hands shoved in his pockets, and Grace watched him with growing concern. "What is wrong?" she asked finally. Graham stopped pacing and turned to face her. "Nothing is wrong, but I need to talk to you about something important." He took a deep breath. "The owner of the Triple Bar is getting older, and he has been talking about selling the ranch. He offered to sell me a portion of it, about 200 acres in the north section. It is good land, with water and grass. He would give me fair terms, payments spread over several years." Grace's heart began to beat faster. "That sounds wonderful." "It would mean I could start my own operation," Graham continued. "Build a house, run my own cattle." He paused, then added quietly, "It would mean I could offer a woman a real home, not just promises and dreams." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Grace stood up slowly, her legs feeling unsteady. "Graham, what are you saying?" He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides and took her hands in his. "I am saying that I love you, Grace. I have loved you since the day I saw you by this creek, trying so hard to hold yourself together, even when everything was falling apart. You are the strongest, bravest, most beautiful woman I have ever known, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." He dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. "Grace Bennett, will you marry me?" Grace could not speak. Tears were streaming down her face, and her chest felt so tight she could barely breathe, but she managed to nod and then to whisper, "Yes, yes, I will marry you." Graham stood and pulled her into his arms, and they held each other as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear overhead. They were married on a clear November morning in 1883 in the small church at the edge of Calico. Grace wore a simple white dress that Graham had insisted on buying for her, despite her protests that her burgundy dress would do just fine. Mrs. Chen stood up as her witness, and one of Graham's fellow cowboys from the Triple Bar stood up for him. The ceremony was brief and simple, but when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, and Graham kissed her, Grace felt as if her heart might burst from happiness. They had a small celebration afterward at the boarding house, with cake and coffee and well wishes from the few people who had become friends to them both. Then Graham helped Grace onto his horse, along with the few possessions she had accumulated, and they rode out to the land that was now theirs. Graham had been working on the house for months, using every spare moment and most of his savings to buy lumber and supplies. It was small, just 3 rooms, but it was solid and well built, with a good roof and real glass windows. There was a bedroom with a proper bed frame that Graham had built himself, a main room with a table and chairs and a wood stove, and a small kitchen area with shelves for supplies. To Grace, who had spent the last year and a half living in a tiny room under the eaves of a boarding house, it looked like a palace. "It is not much yet," Graham said, sounding uncertain as he helped her down from the horse. "But I will add on to it as we can afford it, maybe another bedroom and a proper porch." "It is perfect," Grace said, and meant it with all her heart. That first night in their new home, they lay in bed together, and Grace marveled at how much her life had changed. A year ago, she had been alone and desperate, mending her only dress and wondering how she would survive. Now she was married to a good man who loved her, and she had a home and a future stretching out before her like an unwritten book. "What are you thinking?" Graham asked, his voice soft in the darkness. "I am thinking about the day you saw me mending my dress," Grace said, "about how you came to the boarding house the next day with news that you had bought me 3 new ones. I thought it was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for me." Graham pulled her closer. "It was not kindness, it was love. I just did not know it yet." "Neither did I," Grace admitted. "But I think maybe I started falling in love with you that day." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Grace felt completely safe. The first year of their marriage was hard work, but filled with joy. Graham rose before dawn every day to work the land and tend the small herd of cattle he was building. Grace learned to cook and keep house, to tend the vegetable garden she had planted behind the house, to preserve food for the winter months. She had never worked so hard in her life, but it was different from the work she had done at the boarding house. This was work that mattered, work that was building something real and lasting. In the evenings, after the chores were done and supper was eaten, they would sit together on the porch Graham had built, watching the sun set over the desert and talking about their dreams. Graham wanted to expand the herd, maybe buy some horses to break and sell. Grace wanted to plant fruit trees and maybe keep some chickens. They talked about children, about how many they wanted and what they would name them. "I want our children to have better than I did," Graham said one evening. "I want them to know that their father loves them and that their mother is valued and respected. I want them to grow up feeling safe." "They will," Grace said, taking his hand, "because they will have you as a father." The seasons turned, and winter came to the California desert. It was not the brutal cold of more northern places, but the nights were chilly, and Grace was grateful for the solid walls of their house and the warmth of the wood stove. She spent the short winter days sewing and reading the books Graham borrowed for her from the ranch owner's library. She was teaching herself to paint with the watercolors Graham had given her, and though her early attempts were clumsy, she found joy in the process. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers across the desert, and Grace realized with a mixture of excitement and nervousness that her monthly courses had not come. She waited another month to be certain, and then she told Graham. "I am going to have a baby," she said one evening as they sat down to supper. Graham's fork clattered to his plate. "You are certain?" "As certain as I can be without seeing a doctor," Grace said. "I think the baby will come in late autumn." Graham was around the table in an instant, pulling Grace to her feet and into his arms. "A baby," he kept saying. "We are going to have a baby." Grace laughed and cried at the same time, overwhelmed by the intensity of his joy. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Grace was exhausted and nauseated for the first few months. Graham was attentive and worried, insisting that she rest more and do less heavy work. He took over most of the household chores, coming in from working the cattle to cook meals and wash dishes and sweep the floors. Grace protested at first, but she was secretly grateful for his help. As her belly grew round and her body changed, Grace sometimes felt self-conscious, but Graham only seemed to love her more. He would place his hands on her stomach, feeling for the baby's movements, and his face would light up with wonder. "Strong little one," he would say when the baby kicked, "just like your mother." In October of 1884, on a cool, clear morning, Grace's labor began. Graham rode to town to fetch the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Torres, who had delivered half the babies in Calico. She arrived calm and efficient, taking charge of the situation with practiced ease. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the day and into the night. Graham paced outside, forbidden by custom and propriety from being in the room, though he wanted nothing more than to be by Grace's side. He could hear her cries of pain, and each one felt like a knife to his heart. Finally, as dawn was breaking, he heard a new sound. The sharp, indignant cry of a newborn baby. Torres appeared in the doorway, smiling. "You have a son," she said. "A big, healthy boy, and your wife did beautifully." Graham pushed past her into the bedroom. Grace lay propped against the pillows, her dark hair damp with sweat, and her face pale with exhaustion. But she was smiling, and in her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Graham," she said softly, "come meet your son." Graham approached the bed on shaking legs and looked down at the baby. He had a round red face and a shock of dark hair, and his tiny fists were waving in the air. As Graham watched, the baby's eyes opened, revealing dark blue irises that would probably change color in time. "He is perfect," Graham whispered. "You are both perfect." They named the baby Gabriel, after Graham's mother's father, who had been the only member of Graham's family to show him any real kindness. Little Gabriel was a fussy baby at first, crying often and sleeping in short bursts that left both Graham and Grace exhausted. But gradually, he settled into a routine, and Grace found that she loved being a mother even more than she had imagined she would. Graham was a devoted father, taking over the baby's care whenever he was in the house so that Grace could rest. He would walk the floor with Gabriel in the middle of the night, singing old cowboy songs in his deep, rumbling voice until the baby fell back asleep. He made a wooden cradle with his own hands, sanding it smooth so there would be no splinters, and painted it a cheerful blue. The years passed in a blur of hard work and small joys. The ranch prospered slowly but steadily, and Graham was able to expand the herd and add a barn and a proper corral. Grace's garden flourished, and she learned to preserve enough vegetables to see them through the winters with plenty to spare. She sold her extra produce in town, and the small income helped buy supplies and save for the future. When Gabriel was 2 years old, Grace became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and in the spring of 1887, she gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, after no one in particular, but simply because they both loved the name. Sarah was a calm, contented baby, the opposite of her fussy older brother, and Grace sometimes joked that God was giving them a break after the difficulty of Gabriel's infancy. Graham had insisted on changing his daughter's surname to Baker before she was born, saying he wanted her to have a fresh start and not carry the weight of his own difficult family history. Grace had been touched by the gesture, understanding what it meant for him to make that break with his past, and she had agreed readily. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Gabriel grew into a sturdy, adventurous boy who followed his father everywhere, asking endless questions about the cattle and the horses and how everything worked. Sarah was quieter, more thoughtful, content to sit with Grace in the garden or play with her handmade dolls. Graham's ranch continued to grow, and by 1890 he was employing 2 ranch hands to help with the work. The house had been expanded twice, with 2 additional bedrooms and a real parlor with curtains Grace had sewn herself. They were not wealthy by any means, but they were comfortable and secure in a way that would have seemed impossible to Grace back in those desperate days at the boarding house. One evening in the summer of 1891, after the children were in bed, Grace and Graham sat on their porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Grace was 40 years old now, and Graham was a few years older, with gray streaking his dark hair and lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the desert sun. "Do you ever think about that day by the creek?" Grace asked, leaning against Graham's shoulder. "When you saw me mending my dress?" "All the time," Graham said. "It was the day my life really began." "Mine too," Grace said. "I was so lost back then, so alone. I did not think I would ever be happy again." Graham put his arm around her and pulled her close. "Are you happy now?" "More than I ever dreamed possible," Grace said honestly. She thought about everything they had built together, the home, the ranch, the family, the life they had carved out of the harsh desert landscape through hard work and determination and love. "You saved me, you know. When you bought those dresses for me, you gave me back my dignity. You made me feel like I mattered." "You saved me too," Graham said quietly. "I was just going through the motions before I met you, working, saving money, but not really living. You gave me a reason to want more from life. You gave me a future worth working for." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and Grace thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, the pain and loss that had preceded it, the chance encounter that had changed everything, the slow building of trust and love and partnership. "I want to tell you something," Graham said suddenly. "Something I have never told you before." Grace looked up at him, curious. "What is it?" "That day by the creek, when I saw you mending your dress, it was not actually chance that I was there," Graham admitted. "I had seen you in town a few times before, and I had asked around about you. Mrs. Chen told me you went to the creek sometimes to do your mending. I rode out there, hoping I might run into you." Grace pulled back to look at him properly. "You did?" "Yes," Graham said, looking slightly embarrassed. "I had been trying to work up the courage to talk to you for weeks. You always looked so proud and strong, even though I could tell you were struggling. I wanted to help, but I did not know how to approach you without seeming forward or improper." Grace started to laugh. "So you just happened to need to water your horse at that exact spot?" "I am not proud of it," Graham said, but he was smiling too. "But I could not think of any other way to start a conversation. And then you saw my dress and decided to buy me new ones," Grace said. "That must have taken all your savings." "Most of it," Graham admitted. "But it was the best money I ever spent." Grace reached up and touched his face, running her fingers over the familiar lines and angles. "I love you," she said. "I loved you even then, I think, though I did not understand it yet." "I love you too," Graham said, "more than I could ever put into words." They kissed, a gentle, familiar kiss that held years of love and partnership and shared struggle, and then they went inside, hand in hand, to the home they had built together. The years continued to pass, bringing both challenges and blessings. There was a drought one year that killed half the herd and left them struggling to make ends meet. Graham worked extra jobs in town to keep them afloat, and Grace sold her paintings, which had improved considerably over the years, to anyone who would buy them. They survived, as they always did, through hard work and determination, and their unwavering commitment to each other. Gabriel grew into a fine young man, tall and strong like his father, with a natural way with horses that made him invaluable on the ranch. Sarah developed a love of books and learning, and Grace and Graham scrimped and saved to send her to a small boarding school in San Francisco for 2 years, wanting her to have opportunities they had never had. In 1895, Graham surprised Grace by using their savings to buy her a proper set of oil paints and a dozen stretch canvases. "You have been painting on paper for years," he said. "It is time you had the real materials." Grace cried when she opened the package, overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness. She set up a small studio in one corner of their expanded house and began to paint in earnest. Her subjects were the world around her, the desert landscape, the ranch, the cattle, and most often, her family. She painted Graham working with the horses, his face shadowed by his hat, but his strong hands gentle on the reins. She painted Gabriel and Sarah playing in the yard. She painted the house itself, their home, standing solid and strong against the vast sky. Some of her paintings she sold, but most she kept, creating a visual record of their life together. One spring morning in 1898, Grace woke to find Graham standing at the window of their bedroom, looking out over the land he had worked for nearly 15 years. "What are you thinking about?" she asked sleepily. He turned, and his face was thoughtful. "I am thinking about how much has changed since I first came to California. I was 24 years old, with nothing but a horse and a saddle and a head full of dreams that seemed impossible. And now, look at what we have built." Grace got out of bed and went to stand beside him. From the window, she could see the barn and the corrals, the pastures where the cattle grazed, the vegetable garden that was just beginning to show green shoots, and beyond all of that, the vast, beautiful desert stretching to the horizon. "We built it together," she said, taking his hand. "Yes," Graham agreed. "Together. That is the only way anything worth having ever gets built." That summer, Gabriel announced that he was courting a girl from town, the daughter of the general store owner. Her name was Margaret, and she was a sensible, kind young woman who loved Gabriel despite his rough edges and cowboy ways. Graham and Grace liked her immediately and gave the relationship their blessing. Sarah came home from her school in San Francisco with news that she had been offered a position as a teacher in Calico. "I want to come home," she said. "I want to teach the children here. There are so many who need education, and I can help provide it." Graham and Grace were proud beyond measure. Their children had grown into good, capable adults who were making their own way in the world while still maintaining strong ties to their family and community. In the autumn of 1899, Gabriel and Margaret were married in the same small church where Graham and Grace had been wed 16 years earlier. It was a joyful celebration, with half the town in attendance. Gabriel and his new wife moved into a small cabin on the ranch property, and Gabriel took over more and more of the daily operations, allowing Graham to finally slow down a bit after years of relentless work. Grace, now in her late 40s, found that her body was feeling the effects of years of hard labor. Her hands ached on cold mornings, and her back complained if she worked too long in the garden. But she did not mind. These small pains were the price of a life well lived, of years spent building something real and lasting. On a cool evening in November of 1900, as Grace and Graham sat on their porch watching the sun set, Gabriel came to tell them that Margaret was expecting a baby. "You are going to be grandparents," he said, grinning. Graham let out a whoop of joy and pulled his son into a bear hug, and Grace laughed and cried at the same time, overwhelmed by the realization that their family was growing into another generation. The baby, a boy they named George, was born healthy and strong in the spring of 1901. Graham held his grandson for the first time, with tears streaming down his weathered face, and Grace saw in his expression all the love and hope and fierce protectiveness that she had first seen when he held their own children. "He has your eyes," Graham said to Grace, looking down at the baby's dark gaze. "And your strong hands," Grace replied, touching one tiny, perfectly formed fist. Little George became the light of their lives. Graham, who had worked so hard for so many years, finally allowed himself to slow down and enjoy the role of grandfather. He spent hours with the baby, telling him stories and singing him the same old cowboy songs he had once sung to Gabriel and Sarah. Grace painted constantly during this period, trying to capture every precious moment. She painted George in his cradle, George taking his first wobbly steps, George laughing in his grandfather's arms. She wanted to preserve these moments forever, to create a record of the love and joy that filled their lives. In 1903, Sarah married a young teacher who had come to Calico to work at the school with her. His name was Thomas Fletcher, and he was a gentle, intellectual man who treated Sarah with respect and affection. They built a small house in town, close to the school, and Sarah continued teaching while also starting a family of their own. By 1905, Grace and Graham had 4 grandchildren, with another on the way. The ranch was prosperous and well established, a respected operation that employed several hands and ran a substantial herd. Gabriel had proven himself a capable manager, and Graham was able to step back into a more advisory role. Grace's paintings had gained a modest following, and she occasionally sold pieces to collectors from San Francisco and Los Angeles who came through Calico. She never made much money from her art, but that was not the point. The painting gave her joy and a way to express the deep love she felt for her family and the land they had made their home. One winter evening, when Grace was 54 years old and Graham was nearing 60, they sat together in front of the fire in their parlor. The house was quiet, with Gabriel and his family in their own cabin and Sarah and her family in town. It was just the two of them, the way it had been in the beginning. "Do you remember what you said to me that day by the creek?" Grace asked. "When I asked why you would buy dresses for a stranger? I said sometimes the things that seem most broken are the ones most worth saving," Graham replied immediately. Grace smiled. "I have thought about those words so many times over the years. I thought at the time you were talking about my dress, but you were really talking about me." "I was talking about both of us," Graham said quietly. "We were both broken in our own ways, me from my childhood, you from losing your father and being left alone. But we saved each other." "Yes," Grace agreed, "we did." She leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart. They had been married for more than 20 years now, had built a life and a family and a legacy together. And through all of it, the love between them had only grown stronger. "If you could go back," Graham said thoughtfully, "back to that day when you were mending your dress by the creek, what would you tell your younger self?" Grace considered the question. "I would tell her not to give up hope, that even when everything seems darkest, something wonderful might be just around the corner, that a kind stranger might see her struggling and decide to help, and that small act of kindness will change everything." She paused, then added, "What would you tell your younger self?" "I would tell him to be brave," Graham said, "to not be afraid to reach out to the woman he has been watching from afar, because she is going to give him everything he never knew he wanted, a home, a family, a reason to wake up every morning with joy in his heart." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to embers. Outside, the wind whistled across the desert, but inside they were warm and safe and together. The years continued to flow by like water. There were challenges, of course, there always were. Drought years and years of illness, the death of old friends, the inevitable aches and pains of aging bodies. But there was also so much joy. More grandchildren, 7 in total eventually, who filled the ranch with laughter and energy. Gabriel proved himself a shrewd businessman, expanding the ranch's operations and its reputation. Sarah became the head teacher at the Calico school and a respected figure in the community. In 1912, when Grace was 61 years old, she held her first great-grandchild, a little girl with dark hair and gray-green eyes just like Graham's, standing in the sunlit parlor of their home. Surrounded by children and grandchildren and now a great-grandchild, Grace felt a wave of profound gratitude wash over her. She thought about the girl she had been, alone and frightened, mending her only dress by the creek because she had nothing else. She thought about how close she had come to giving up, to letting despair win. And then she thought about Graham, about the way he had looked at her with such compassion and understanding, about the dresses he had bought her and the future he had offered, about all the days and years that had followed, each one a gift. "What are you thinking?" Graham asked, coming to stand beside her. He moved more slowly now, his joints stiff with arthritis, his hair completely white, but his eyes were the same, still full of kindness and love. "I am thinking that I am the luckiest woman who ever lived," Grace said honestly. Graham smiled and put his arm around her shoulders. "I am the lucky one." "We both are," Grace said. That evening, after all the family had gone to their own homes and the house was quiet again, Grace and Graham walked out to the porch. It was a warm summer night, and the stars were brilliant overhead. They sat in the rocking chairs that Graham had built years ago, holding hands and looking out over the land they had worked so hard to build. "I have been thinking," Graham said after a while, "about what happens next. We are getting older, and I want to make sure everything is in order for when we are gone." Grace felt a small pang at the mention of mortality, but she nodded. "It is wise to plan ahead." "Gabriel will inherit the ranch," Graham said. "He has earned it, and he will take good care of it. But I want to make sure Sarah and the grandchildren are provided for as well. I have been talking to a lawyer in town about drawing up a proper will." "That sounds like a good idea," Grace said. "There is something else," Graham continued. "I want to make sure your paintings are preserved. You have created a record of our life together, and I think it is important. I have spoken with the Historical Society in San Francisco, and they are interested in acquiring the collection." Grace was surprised. "You have?" "I have," Graham confirmed. "I know you paint for yourself, not for recognition. But what you have created is valuable, Grace. Not just to our family, but to anyone who wants to understand what life was like in these times. The struggles and the joys, the hard work and the love." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "I never thought of it that way." "You should," Graham said gently. "You have given the world something beautiful, something that will last long after we are both gone." They sat in silence for a while, contemplating the future and the legacy they would leave behind. And as Grace looked out over the land they had built together, she felt a deep sense of peace. Whatever came next, they had lived well. They had loved deeply. They had created something that would endure. The years moved on, as years do. Graham's health began to fail gradually, his strong body finally wearing out after decades of hard labor. He moved more slowly, worked less, spent more time in the rocking chair on the porch, but his mind remained sharp and his love for Grace never wavered. Grace herself was feeling the weight of her years. Her hands, which had once been so nimble with a needle and a paintbrush, were twisted with arthritis. She could no longer paint the detailed works she once had, but she still sketched sometimes, capturing moments and memories in simple lines. In the spring of 1918, when Grace was 67 and Graham was nearing 72, Graham became seriously ill. The doctor diagnosed pneumonia and shook his head gravely. Graham was a strong man, but at his age, with his weakened constitution, the prognosis was not good. Grace refused to leave his side. She sat by his bed day and night, holding his hand, talking to him, reminding him of all the beautiful moments they had shared. Gabriel and Sarah came with their families, and the house was full of love and grief, and the bittersweet knowledge that they were nearing the end of an era. On a warm evening in May, as the sun was setting and golden light streamed through the window, Graham's breathing grew labored. Grace leaned close, holding his hand tightly. "I am here," she whispered. "I am right here with you." Graham's eyes opened, and even through the haze of fever and pain, his gaze was clear. "Grace," he whispered, "my Grace, thank you for saying yes." "Thank you for asking," Grace said, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for seeing me, for loving me, for giving me this beautiful life." "No regrets?" Graham asked, his voice barely audible. "Not a single one," Grace said firmly. "Not one moment of it. Every day with you has been a gift." Graham smiled, and Grace saw in that smile all the love they had shared over 35 years of marriage. "I will wait for you," he said. "On the other side, I will be waiting." "I know," Grace said, "but not yet. I still have work to do here." Graham's eyes closed, and his breathing slowed. The family gathered around, Gabriel holding his father's other hand, Sarah standing at the foot of the bed with tears running down her face. And as the last light faded from the sky, Graham took one final breath and was still. Grace sat with him for a long time after, still holding his hand, reluctant to let go. When she finally did, when she allowed Gabriel to gently lead her away from the bed, she felt as if a part of her had gone with Graham, the best part, maybe. They buried Graham on a hill overlooking the ranch, in a spot he had picked out years earlier. The entire community came to pay their respects, testimony to the respect and affection Graham had earned over his decades in Calico. Grace stood at the graveside, supported by her children, and watched as they lowered the coffin into the ground. And she remembered the man Graham had been, strong and kind, hard-working and gentle, devoted to his family and true to his word. The weeks after Graham's death were the hardest of Grace's life. The house felt empty without him, and she found herself constantly turning to say something to him before remembering he was gone. She slept poorly, unused to the empty space beside her in the bed. She moved through her days mechanically, doing what needed to be done, but finding no joy in it. Gabriel and Sarah were worried about her, she could tell. They visited constantly, bringing the grandchildren, trying to coax her out of her grief. But Grace needed time. She needed to figure out how to live in a world without Graham in it. Slowly, gradually, she began to heal. Not to forget, never that, but to find a way to carry her grief without being crushed by it. She started painting again, simple sketches at first, and then more ambitious pieces. She painted Graham from memory, trying to capture not just his appearance, but his essence. The kindness in his eyes, the strength in his hands, the gentle curve of his smile. She painted their life together, all the moments big and small that had made up their marriage. The house they had built, the children they had raised, the land they had worked, the love they had shared. And as she painted, she found a kind of peace. Graham was gone, but he was not truly lost. He lived on in their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. He lived on in the ranch he had built and the community he had served. And he lived on in Grace's heart, as alive and present as he had been on the day they first met. Grace lived for 7 more years after Graham's death. They were quiet years, spent mostly at the ranch, surrounded by family. She watched her grandchildren grow and her great-grandchildren multiply. She attended weddings and christenings and birthday celebrations. She continued to paint, creating a final series of works that the San Francisco Historical Society later called her masterpiece, a visual chronicle of life in the Old West, told through the lens of love and family. On a summer evening in 1925, Grace sat on the porch of the house she and Graham had built together. She was 74 years old, and she could feel that her time was growing short. Her body was failing bit by bit, but she did not mind. She had lived a long, full life, and she was ready for what came next. Gabriel came out to sit with her, his own hair now gray, his face lined with the cares of managing the ranch and raising his family. "How are you feeling, Mother?" he asked. "I am well," Grace said, and it was true. She felt a deep contentment, a sense of completion. "I have been thinking about your father today." "I think about him every day," Gabriel said quietly. "So do I," Grace said. "And do you know what I think about most? That day by the creek, when he saw me mending my only dress. I was so lost then, so alone. I thought my life was over, but your father saw something in me that I could not see in myself. He saw that I was worth saving." "You saved each other," Gabriel said, echoing the words his parents had said to each other so many times over the years. "We did," Grace agreed. She reached out and took her son's hand. "And now you have to do the same for the next generation. Save each other, love each other, build something that will last." "We will," Gabriel promised. "You and Father taught us how." Grace smiled and closed her eyes, feeling the warm evening breeze on her face. She could hear the sounds of the ranch, the lowing of cattle and the whinny of horses and the distant laughter of children. And under it all, she could almost hear Graham's voice, singing one of those old cowboy songs he had loved so much. "I will wait for you," he had said. On the other side, Grace was ready to stop waiting. She passed away peacefully in her sleep that night, surrounded by the family she and Graham had created. They buried her beside him on the hill overlooking the ranch, and on her headstone, they carved the words she had requested. She was loved, and she loved in return. What more could anyone ask? Years later, decades later, the ranch still stood. It had passed through generations now, each one adding their own contributions while honoring the foundation that Graham and Grace had laid. The house had been expanded and modernized, but the original 3 rooms were still there, preserved as a reminder of where it all began. And in the parlor, hanging in places of honor, were several of Grace's paintings. There was one of Graham working with the horses, his face shadowed but his strong hands gentle on the reins. There was one of the house as it had looked when they first built it, small and simple but solid and true. And there was one that Grace had painted near the end of her life, a memory of a scene that had happened decades earlier. A young woman kneeling by a creek, mending a worn dress, while a cowboy on horseback approached in the distance. It was the moment their story began, the moment when a simple act of kindness changed 2 lives forever, the moment when a cowboy saw a woman in need and decided to help, not knowing that in saving her, he would also save himself. And though Grace and Graham were long gone, their love story lived on, in the ranch they had built, in the family they had raised, in the paintings Grace had created, and the memories their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren carried in their hearts. They had started with nothing but hope and determination, and a willingness to take a chance on each other. And they had built something beautiful, something lasting, something that would endure long after they were both gone. The cowboy had found her mending her only dress, and he had bought her 3 new ones the very next day. But more than that, he had given her a future, a family, and a love that would last beyond death and into eternity. And she, in turn, had given him the same. It was a simple story in many ways, but it was also everything.